Before I get into the rule of two proper, I need to cover something that I ended up omitting from the first video on the Path of Destruction, the backstory behind the Darth Bane trilogy as a whole. I meant to include it in the first video, but I was on such a roll with the intro that I had that I just went with it, and I didn't want to grind things to a halt just to go into the backstory. So, belatedly, origin story time. Like a lot of people, Drew Karpyshyn had been a Star Wars fan since childhood. By his own admission, after seeing the films for the first time, he dressed up as a Jawa for Halloween for 4 years straight. Of course, his first big Star Wars related break was being lead writer for Knights of the Old Republic. It was the success of KOTOR that, as Karpyshyn put it, let me get my foot in the door at LucasArts. And in 2006, 3 years later, he would publish Darth Bane: Path of Destruction. But neither Darth Bane nor his Rule of Two begin with Karpyshyn himself. The very first reference to the Rule of Two is in The Phantom Menace during Qui-Gon's funeral when Yoda says, "Always two there are, no more, no less, a master and an apprentice." The first reference to Darth Bane by name comes in the novelization of The Phantom Menace written by Terry Brooke of Shannara fame. Although in the novelization, Bane's apprentice is mentioned as being male rather than female, so clearly things were still pretty hazy at this point. Then, with the release of the supplement book Star Wars: The Essential Chronology in 2000, Darth Bane and the creation of the Rule of Two was explicitly connected to Ruusan and the events of the Jedi Knight video game, which is why it is the souls of the victims of the Battle of Ruusan that Kyle Katarn liberates at the conclusion. Then in 2001, Dark Horse published a 6-issue comic called Jedi vs. Sith, written by Croatian Darko Machan and illustrated by Spaniard Ramon F. Box. Comic fans know this because I used some of the illustrations from that comic in the previous video, because it is here where Darth Bane makes his first visual appearance as a character. Jedi vs. Sith, along with another story that I will talk about later in this video, are kind of overwritten by the events of Path of Destruction and the Rule of Two, as they all cover the downfall of the Brotherhood of Sith, as well as the death of Lord Hoth and his 100 followers, as well as Bane's discovery of Zanna and his creation of the Rule of Two. That's the origin. Now let's talk about the Rule of Two, the book. We begin where Path of Destruction left off, in the immediate aftermath of the final Battle of Ruusan, Khan's detonation of the thought bomb, the death of Lord Hoth and his 100 doomed volunteers, and the annihilation of the Brotherhood of Darkness. Darth Bane, Dark Lord of the Sith, is now the only one of his kind left. And now he's found an apprentice that he can hopefully mold into a worthy successor. And that means it's time to talk briefly about Zanna and where she came from. Which means going into a bit of detail about how the Darth Bane trilogy kind of overwrites the Jedi vs. Sith comic, as many of the things that are depicted or made explicit in Jedi vs. Sith are reduced to vague summaries in the Rule of Two, mostly in the memories of Zanna and another character we are soon to meet named Daravit. Not long ago, although in many ways it was almost another life, Zanna had grown up on a tiny rural world called Somov Rit. She had never known her parents and had been raised by her older cousin Root alongside two younger cousins, Daravit and Hardin. It was the custom of Somov Rit that the inhabitants be referred to by nicknames, and so Zanna, Hardin, and Daravit were known as Rain, Bug, and Tomcat, respectively. As the struggle between Jedi and Sith grew more desperate, a Jedi scout by the name of Tor Snappet had come to their world, for the Army of Light had gotten desperate enough to resorting to recruit children for a war zone, and all 3 children were believed to be strong in the Force. Tomcat, who had grown up on stories of Jedi heroism, was eager to go. Rain, the naive innocent, had just wanted to go with her family. Bug the cynic had gone, but hadn't really expected much. Tragedy had struck as soon as they'd arrived on Ruusan. A Sith attack damaged their shuttle, and Rain was lost, presumed dead. Tor Snappet, the Jedi scout, ended up sacrificing himself to allow the 2 boys to escape a marauding band of Sith soldiers. Bug and Tomcat had found the Army of Light, But instead of the glorious, heroic host that Tomcat had dreamed of, they saw a weary and desperate band just struggling to hang on. This proved such a shattering disillusionment that Tomcat, Daravit, actually ended up defecting to the Sith. By contrast, Bug, Hardin, actually began to lose his cynicism and look up to the Jedi as his cousin once had. He saw that it was not glory or shining swords that made the Jedi noble, it was their willingness to fight and suffer for a righteous cause. They weren't larger than life, but they were heroes. Tragically, the two cousins ended up fighting one another in the final phase of the Battle of Ruusan, well within range of the thought bomb. And so Hardin's soul was sucked away to join the others in torment and agony for 1,000 years. Daravit, to his own confusion, stood unharmed. Had he somehow lost his connection to the Force? It was the only possible explanation, for the thought bomb explicitly targeted Force sensitives. And yet he was alive, and Hardin was not. Only then did the enormity of Daravit's betrayal sink in, and he fled the site of his cousin's death, forsaking the dark side. Meanwhile, Rain, Zanna, had in fact survived her fall from the shuttle, and had been looked after by some of the local bouncers, including a motherly individual named La. Unfortunately, as the battle between light side and dark side had raged across Ruusan, many bouncers had been driven mad and had proceeded to torment the Jedi with telepathic visions of suffering and fear, forcing the Jedi to adopt a policy of shooting any and all bouncers on sight. And in the aftermath of the thought bomb's detonation, two young Jedi had stumbled upon La and Zanna, assumed the alien was menacing the little girl, and killed her, causing Zanna to lash out in rage, killing both Jedi with the Force. And so Bane had found her, weeping beside La's body and the two Jedi corpses, and decided that here might be an apprentice worthy of his vision for the Sith. Having found his apprentice, Bane decided that it might actually be worthwhile to check the Sith camp before departing Ruusan, partly in case there was any useful information or artifacts left behind, and perhaps as a chance to begin Zanna's instruction in the ways of the dark side. When he found a few survivors scavenging the camp, not Sith, those were all gone, but ordinary mooks, Bane sadistically killed a few of them, partly as demonstration of the dark side's power to his new apprentice, partly so that they would spread rumors. Zanna questioned if that was wise given that the Sith are supposed to remain secret now. But Bane believed that stories propagated by lowly minions of the Sith would not be taken seriously by anyone, and would in fact reaffirm the conviction that the Sith were extinct. Such wild tales would come off as the kind of conspiracy theories cooked up by cranks, wild tales that no ordinary person would ever take seriously. The scavengers dealt with, Bane did a quick search of the camp and did find something interesting. A map to the location of the tomb of Freedon Nad, an ancient Sith Lord that resided on the moon of Duxan. Given that the old Sith Lords loved to take some of their most potent artifacts with them to the grave, Bane decided that this might be something worth investigating. But first, he took Zanna down into the caves to show her the thought bomb, the ultimate proof, in Bane's eyes, of the folly of the Brotherhood of Darkness and Khan's idea of cooperation and equality among Sith. Even before they came to the chamber of the thought bomb, they could sense the terrible energies locked within and the torment of the souls that would be trapped there for eternity. But in that chamber, they also stumbled onto Daravit, who had also gone into the cave seeking answers to what had happened. At first, he was overjoyed to see his cousin, but then he spotted the dark, menacing bald man behind her and tried to attack Bane. Knowing that her master would not scruple to kill a boy, Zanna did the only thing she could to save Daravit's life. She used the Force to destroy his right hand, claiming that he was so weak that there was nothing to be gained by killing him. Bane, of course, sensed her bullshit, but decided to let it slide. Zanna was young, and there would be plenty of time to teach her the ruthless cruelty of the Sith. Afterwards, he decided that the first test for his new apprentice would be the equivalent of throwing her into the deep end to see if she could swim. He would be going to Onderon, but he would not be taking her with him. She had 10 days to find her own way there. If she was strong and clever enough, she would succeed and he would begin her training properly. If she couldn't, then she wasn't worth his time. With that, Bane boarded the Valsen and abandoned the confused, frightened, and angry little girl and went on his way to Duxon. Meanwhile, as the Jedi began evacuating Ruusan after their victory, we are introduced to another prominent character of the story, Jothan Othone, former Padawan of the late Lord Hoth. Which brings me to my first criticism with the Rule of Two, and while, though still a good book overall, I regard it as the weakest of the Darth Bane trilogy. If you noted his absence from Path of Destruction despite his association with Hoth, a fairly prominent character in that story, it is not any mistake on your part or mine. Jothan does not appear in Path of Destruction at all, which is odd because you would think an apprentice of someone as prominent as Hoth would at least be mentioned in Path of Destruction. I've got no proof, but this gives me the sneaking suspicion that Karpyshyn either didn't intend to create any sequels initially to Path of Destruction, or he did and realized too late that he would need a Jedi POV character for Rule of Two, but couldn't write Jothan backwards into Path of Destruction. At any rate, Jothan wanted to go down to the surface of Ruusan and help in the recovery effort. And despite being expressly forbidden from doing so by Valentine Farfalla, the last surviving leader of the Army of Light, because he feared that the effects of the thought bomb might still be lingering, he went down anyway by mind-tricking his way aboard a recovery shuttle. Later, down on the surface, he met two surviving scavengers that had escaped Bane, and after listening to their fearful account of what had happened to them, became convinced that at least one Sith Lord still lived. Unfortunately, the fact that Jothan had disobeyed a direct order and had used the Force on an innocent Republic soldier for his own ends did not make his arguments very convincing to Farfalla. And, just as Bane had predicted, the Jedi Master was inclined to dismiss the account of the two former Sith mercenaries as self-serving lies. Besides, why would a Sith allow witnesses that could expose him to survive? If he was indeed the killer of their comrades, why didn't he kill these two as well? Meanwhile, back on Ruusan, the shuttle crew, consisting of a Republic soldier named Irtana and 3 Ruusan natives, Bordon and his young sons Tallow and Wend, discovered Zanna wandering the wastes. Seeing an opportunity to get off-world and meet up with her master, Zanna accepted their pity and their food, and tried to persuade Irtana to take her to Onderon, claiming that she had family there. However, the soldier was inclined to take her to the orbiting Republic fleet first, and this was something Zanna very much wanted to avoid. Going to the fleet meant proximity to the Jedi, who would sense her talent and start asking questions that would inevitably lead to Bane. But then, Bordon made an unexpected offer. He gave to Zanna the offer of living with him and his sons, at least until they could contact her relatives on Onderon. It was an offer of peace and contentment, and after all the hardships she'd been through, Zanna began to wonder if this might be what she really wanted all along. After all, Bane had warned her that the life of a Sith in training was to be very dangerous and very difficult. Plus, he'd abandoned her. Did she really owe him any kind of loyalty? Let alone the kind of loyalty that would make her willing to go through that sort of thing? At that moment, Wend, Bordon's younger son, interrupted her musings by telling her about what had happened to his mother. She'd been a soldier for the Army of Light and had been killed by the Sith. The little boy expressed sympathy for Zanna, assuming that, like him, she'd lost her family on Ruusan. But, in a dark twist of irony, his story was what decided Zanna. Bordon's family had lost his wife and the mother of his children because they'd been weak. What good is family if you're too weak to defend it? Didn't her master point out that it is the natural order for the strong to rule and the weak to be crushed? Bordon's offer, however kind and well-meaning, was a trap baited with the idea of peace. And peace is a lie. Only with power can one be freed from the shackles of weakness. And so Zanna searched the shuttle for and eventually found a blaster, intending to hijack the shuttle and force the crew to take her to Onderon. At that moment, Bordon's older son Tallow stumbled onto her and tried to take the blaster away. Zanna ended up shooting him fatally in the chest during the struggle, and then killed Bordon when the man came running to see what had happened. She then marched to the cockpit and tried threatening Irtana into taking her to Onderon. The soldier refused to obey, unwilling to believe that a child was capable of cold-blooded murder, at which point Zanna proved her wrong by shooting her. Wend was the last to die, despite the little boy's pleas for mercy. Hadn't Darth Bane said that those who beg for mercy are too weak to deserve it? After several minutes of trying to figure out how the shuttle worked, Zanna finally managed to program the autopilot to head for Onderon. She'd just taken her first real steps toward the dark side. Meanwhile, after his dressing down by Master Farfalla, Johun was taken to Coruscant to meet with Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, Tarsis Valorum. If the name sounds familiar, it's because he is the distant ancestor of Supreme Chancellor Finis Valorum, he of the no-confidence vote from the Phantom Menace. The meeting with the Supreme Chancellor revealed that, in addition to just being weary with the war, thanks to factors that Carpiscian doesn't really go into, many citizens of the Republic had become suspicious of the Jedi Order, a few even going so far as to blame them for the war with the Sith and its devastation. Now that the Brotherhood of Darkness was gone, as a way of reassuring the public that the war was indeed over, and that the Jedi were not just a bunch of religious militants, Valorum and the Galactic Senate were proposing a series of reforms known as the Ruusan reformation. The various sectors of the Republic were to be reorganized, power would be shifted more towards the Senate and away from the office of Chancellor, and most relevant of all, the Jedi were to disband their military forces, including the Army of Light. The Republic government was not going to interfere directly in the affairs of the Order, but henceforth the Order was going to be subordinate to the Republic Senate. Farfalla wasn't keen on the idea of disarmament, Johun was especially opposed, but Valorum was adamant. This was what the Republic's citizenry wanted, and so this is what they would get. To Johun, it seemed that the Republic was determined to dump on the memory of Hoth and everything the Army of Light had sacrificed to save the galaxy from the Sith. But his anger soon vanished when Farfalla declared that he and the Jedi Council had decided to approve his elevation to full Jedi knighthood. That surprise then turned right back into confusion and a little bit of anger when Farfalla told him that his first task as full knight would be to act as Chancellor Valorum's personal protector. Meanwhile, Bane had made it to Duxon, and it's here that Rule of Two overwrites another previous story, Bane of the Sith, written by Kevin J. Anderson. In fact, while Bane was first mentioned by name in the novelization of The Phantom Menace, it is in Bane of the Sith that he makes his first literary appearance. For the most part, the Rule of Two pretty much retains Bane of the Sith almost in its entirety. Bane is haunted by the spirits of Cordus and Lord Khan, the latter of which doesn't really make sense since Khan was killed by the thought bomb and therefore his spirit should still be trapped inside it, but Carpiscian does suggest in the text that these might just be hallucinations brought on by after effects of the thought bomb messing with Bane's head. At any rate, the hallucinations get so bad that Bane ends up crashing the Valsen, damaging it beyond repair, but he is able to find the tomb of Freedon Nad. After rummaging around for a while, he finally stumbles upon the most important thing that a Force user could find in the burial site of another, Nad's holocron, a Force-driven data storage containing all of his knowledge. Unfortunately, as is often the case with Sith tombs, Nad's burial site is booby-trapped, and suddenly Bane finds himself under a rain of bug-like aliens known as orbalisks. Think horseshoe crabs that have traded in their tails for really nasty attitudes. Two orbalisks end up digging into Bane's skin, one on his chest and one on his back, and despite his efforts, the Sith Lord can't remove them, in spite of the immense pain they're causing him. After narrowly escaping the chamber of the orbalisks, Bane decides that he really has nothing better to do and so activates Nad's holocron, hoping that it has answers to his problem. It turns out that Nad did record a lot of information regarding the orbalisks. The bad news is, 1, there's no getting rid of the things. If an orbalisk is removed or killed, it will inject lethal poison into its host. Secondly, the orbalisks will eventually multiply and cover every surface of Bane's body, although the holocron does provide ways of creating protection for the hands, feet, and face. This way, Bane can kind of conceal the orbalisks and avoid being suffocated by them. On the upside though, Orbalisk Chiton is highly resistant to lightsabers, and because they feed on the dark side, Bane's connection to the Force has been made stronger by them, but at the price that he is more susceptible to his anger. Having learned all that he can from it, Bane departs the tomb, manages to tame one of the savage moon beasts of Duxan, and by creating a barrier of air around him and the monster, takes advantage of the fact that Duxan is often in close proximity to Onderon to fly across the gap of vacuum to the planet. And Rule of Two pretty much replicates Bane of the Sith beat for beat. The only difference is that in Bane of the Sith, Bane was against Khan using the Thought Bomb, whereas in Path of Destruction, Bane deliberately manipulated Khan into using it. At any rate, Bane made it down to Onderon in time to see that Zanna had made it as well, and was being menaced by some of the locals. Naturally, Bane killed them all, and declared that since Zanna had proven herself by making it to Onderon on her own, it was time to begin her real training in the ways of the Sith. We then have a 10-year time skip, and this is where my second criticism of the Rule of Two comes in, and it's kind of identical to the one I had for Path of Destruction. In the previous book, I felt that Karpyshyn might have spent more time developing Bane's struggle to reconnect with the dark side after losing it, him overcoming his guilt over causing the death of his father, bastard though he was, and fully embracing the evil that being a Sith requires. If necessary, I suggested that Karpyshyn should have split Path of Destruction into 2 books. Have the first one focus on Bane's inner struggle and the second half on the events of Ruusan. Here, instead of a time skip, I would have dedicated some time to developing Zanna and especially Johun. Give their characters some more development and get the reader more invested. If necessary, like Path of Destruction, split Rule of Two into 2 volumes. On the subject of Johun, he spent the next 10 years at Valorum's side, even after he ceased to be Supreme Chancellor, occasionally offering advice, but mostly serving as the man's protector. And despite his initial dislike of him, Johun eventually came to recognize the strengths of Valorum and even admire him. Even after leaving office, Valorum remained committed to reforming and helping the galaxy heal after the war, often taking up diplomatic missions to try and help reintegrate worlds back into the Republic and address their grievances. He was also personally brave and self-effacing, unwilling to bring along the kind of massive entourages or armies of security forces that a politician of his status and prestige might be expected to have. Mind you, relying on a single Jedi to protect him sometimes came with risks, such as, for example, when Valorum went to the world of Sereno, trying to persuade its local aristocracy to stop supporting Republic separatist movements. Valorum and Johun were walking along a narrow land bridge that connected the landing pad for their ship with where an aristocrat's mansion was situated when they were suddenly attacked by a group of those self-same separatists. But despite being armed with cortosis-laced vibro blades, Johun was able to best them in the end, although it came pretty close. One of the separatists, a Twi'lek, proved especially skilled, and Johun only won by tackling his opponent so that they both fell off the bridge and towards the ocean far below. Johun only survived the fall by using the Force as a cushion. It was the closest Tarsis Valorum had ever come to being killed, and afterwards, the grateful former Chancellor vowed to Johun that he would offer any kind of favor that was within his power to fulfill. Although Johun had matured and learned better control of his emotions as a true Jedi Knight should over the last decade, there was a part of him that still resented the efforts to wallpaper over the sacrifice of Hoth and his 100 on Ruusan. And so, with Valorum's backing, he petitioned the Senate for the creation of a memorial to the 100 heroes on Ruusan. Many of the Senate were in favor. Ironically, Johun's greatest opposition came from the Jedi Order itself, as many of its senior members, including Farfalla, wanted to put the memory of Ruusan behind them. But attitudes among the fickle citizenry of the Republic had softened toward the Jedi in the last 10 years. They were beginning to look back on the war and the Jedi's service in that war in a positive light, and so there was a lot of public support for the memorial, enough for the Senate to approve funding for the project. And so a series of memorials, each one carved to resemble one of the 100 heroes, began to take shape at the site of the Thought Bomb, a place that would eventually be known as the Valley of the Jedi. At first, the construction of the memorial went well, but then strange things started happening. New equipment began malfunctioning. Tools and supplies left in good condition the previous night were found destroyed or missing the nect morning. Jo-hun suspected sabotage. And so, after keeping vigil on the construction site one night, he finally caught his saboteur in the act and chased him to his home in one of Ruusan's sparse forests, where at last the Jedi was able to get some answers. After Zanna had destroyed his hand and left him where he was, Daravit had wandered off into the wastes of Ruusan. After meeting a few friendly bouncers who helped him recover from his injury, Daravit came to learn the arts of healing, and over the last decade had built up for himself a reputation as a reclusive but helpful hermit, always willing to offer his services to those who needed it. He'd been sabotaging the construction work because he saw the memorial as just a reminder of the horrors of the war, the reopening of old wounds that might even lead to another one. Having been disillusioned with and betrayed both Jedi and Sith during the Ruusan campaign, Daravit had come to hold little distinction between those who followed the light side or the dark side of the Force. In his mind, the war had been a product of the mutual antipathy between Jedi and Sith, which kind of seems to overlook the fact that in every single Jedi-Sith conflict throughout the fictional history of Star Wars, the Sith were always the aggressors. At one point during the argument, Daravit actually blamed Lord Hoth for the thought bomb, saying that he should have stopped Khan from using it rather than goad Khan into detonating it deliberately. And it was during the argument between the Jedi and the Hermit over the war and its righteousness that Daravit let slip the existence of Bane and Zanna. For a decade, Jo-hun hadn't really thought much about the survival of the Sith. He'd accepted the arguments that the Brotherhood of Darkness had all died with Khan. But if Daravit was telling the truth, if there was a Sith Lord still out there in the galaxy, then it was only a matter of time until another great catastrophe befell the Republic. Of course, Jo-hun was mistaken in some of his assumptions. He assumed that Bane was simply waiting for the right moment to build up another army like Khan and strike at the galaxy directly. But he was correct that so long as the Sith remained, there would always be an existential threat to the Jedi and the Republic. And so, with a lot of argumentation and a slight nudge with the Force, he persuaded Daravit to come with him to Coruscant and testify to the Council. Only then could the Jedi Council be convinced to sanction a manhunt for the last surviving Sith. Speaking of the Sith in question, in the 10 years since her training had begun under Bane, Zanna had grown from a scrawny little girl to a beautiful young woman. Beautiful and very, very lethal. Obviously, her training isn't really described in any detail, but it is interesting to note the one detail about it that Bane insisted that she play to her strengths, that she not seek to completely emulate her master. He has his way of doing things, she has hers. He encouraged and fostered her natural talent in Sith sorcery, various esoteric techniques like summoning shadows that inflict pain on what they cut, or destroying the minds of victims. This even extended to styles of lightsaber combat. Bane, being a big, strong man, could favor a more aggressive style. But because Zanna, as a woman, was smaller and weaker, he gave her a double-bladed saber and insisted that she focus on a defensive style, that her strategy should be to outlast her opponent, wear him down until he makes a mistake, giving her the opening to strike. It shows that for all his evil and brutality, in his own way, Bane was actually a very good teacher. Most of that time and training had been spent on the world of Ambria, mostly living in hiding. But even then, Bane was fostering the plan that would one day take the Sith to victory. While keeping his true nature a secret, he'd been establishing a potent information network, mostly by making connections in the criminal underworld of the galaxy, creating a resource of information that, if Zanna should prove worthy, she would inherit upon her killing of Bane and becoming the new Dark Lord of the Sith. But thanks to the orbalisks, which by now covered every inch of his body apart from his face, which does kind of beg the question how he relieves himself, Bane began entrusting more and more off-world missions to Zanna. Such missions included infiltrating anti-Republic groups like the rebels on Sereno and manipulating them into exposing themselves so that they can be crushed by Republic authorities. Bane, aware of the Ruusan reformation and their subordinating of the Jedi Order to the Republic government, was determined to use this to his advantage. To quote the man himself, "The Republic keeps the Jedi in check. It maintains control and imposes order across thousands of worlds. But if the Republic falls, a score of new interstellar governments and galactic organizations will rise. It is far easier to manipulate and control a single enemy than 20. That is why we must seek out radical separatist groups, identify the ones that have the potential to become true threats, then encourage them to strike before they are ready. We must exploit them, playing them off against the Republic. We must let our enemies weaken one another while we stay hidden and grow strong. One day the Republic will fall and the Jedi will be wiped out, but it will not happen until we are ready to seize that power for ourselves." Hence, Zanna going to Sereno, infiltrating the local anti-Republic cell, and actually seducing one of its members, namely the Twi'lek that almost killed Johun, and manipulating him into leading the rash attempt to kidnap Tarsis Valorum. Unfortunately for Zanna, some of the anti-Republican separatists survived the encounter with Johun Othone, blamed her, correctly as it happens, for the ill-considered kidnapping attempt, and brought her to their leader, an aging aristocrat named Hetan. Thoroughly sick of the charade, Zanna decided to end things and unleash her full power, killing one of the separatists that had brought her with her lightsaber, and then destroying the other by using the Sith technique Summon Fear, by which she filled the other woman's mind with her worst, darkest visions, driving her into a state of catatonic insanity. Then, to her own surprise, Hetan actually knelt before Zanna and proclaimed the desire that she take him as an apprentice. Hetan had been born with a strong connection to the Force, and from an early age had leaned towards the teachings of the dark side. Unfortunately, he had lacked formal education in the ways of the Force, his only teachers being a small-time bounty hunter with minor Force sensitivity, and whatever artifacts and scraps of Sith lore that his family's wealth allowed him to buy. But like any good dark side devotee, Hetan craved power, and believed that finally, with a real Sith to teach him, he could achieve that power. When Zanna demurred, saying that her taking him on as an apprentice would violate her master's rule of two, Hetan simply proposed that they team up and kill Bane. And so Zanna decided to bring Hetan and a cadre of his somewhat Force-sensitive bodyguards to Ambria. If Hetan's scheme actually worked out and Bane died, then she figured he was no longer worthy to have the title of Dark Lord. And if Hetan died, well, that was just one less potential threat to her and Bane. When the moment came to ambush her master, she was more than happy to leave Hetan and his guards twisting in the breeze, and of course Bane dispatched them with some ease. Although the bodyguard's electroshock pulls gave him some trouble at first, because orbalisks can protect you from many things, but not electrocution. Unfortunately, as was often the case when he went into battle, Bane fell under the influence of the orbalisks, increasing his anger, even as they increased his strength and combat prowess. Still locked in feverish anger, Bane believed that Zanna had deliberately betrayed him and attacked her. Zanna only narrowly avoided being killed by her enraged master, though she did take a serious beating before she was able to talk him down. Besides, when Hetan had been showing her his collection of artifacts, he'd revealed something that she felt her master might be interested in. Apart from training Zanna to one day succeed him as Dark Lord of the Sith, Bane had one overriding goal at this point in his life. He wished to create his own Sith holocron, ensuring that all the knowledge he'd obtained could be passed on to future generations. But try as he might, the Sith Lord couldn't quite get the hang of it. But when Hetan had been showing his collection of artifacts and Sith lore to Zanna, he had mentioned multiple references to a powerful Shi'ido Sith Lord from a few centuries back named Belia Darzu, who was notable for two things: her skill at creating holocrons and her mastery of an obscure and truly horrific darkside technique called Meku Duru Vitae, which basically allowed her to transform organic beings into mindless cyborg zombies. And it just so happens that one of Hetan's pieces of Sith lore mentioned where Belia had operated and may have stored some of her artifacts: the ancient and mysterious deep core world of Tython, the half-forgotten birth world of the Jedi Order. Bane immediately determined to go there and see if Belia had left behind any record of how to make holocrons. For Zanna, he prescribed a different mission. This recent outburst of his, fueled by the Orbalisks, was beginning to make the Sith Lord think that the negatives of having the parasites grafted to his flesh was outweighing the positives. And so he charged his apprentice with infiltrating the Jedi archives on Coruscant and seeing if she could find a way to safely remove the Orbalisks without killing him. Zanna eagerly accepted the mission, partly out of recognizing how irrational and dangerous her master could be when the fit was on him, but also because if the Orbalisks could be removed, Bane would no longer be nigh invulnerable, which would increase her chances of one day killing him and claiming the mantle of Dark Lord for herself. But whether through bad luck or the will of the Force, Zanna infiltrated the temple at about the same time that Johun returned from Ruusan with Daravit. He left the one-handed healer to wander the archives while he tried to persuade Master Farfalla of his new findings, and of course Daravit bumped into Zanna while she was doing her research. And despite the passage of 10 years and the fact that Zanna had dyed her hair black as part of her disguise, Daravit recognized his cousin instantly. But Daravit chose not to turn her into the Jedi. Because Zanna had crippled him in order to save him from being killed by Bane, he was convinced that despite 10 years of dark side training, Zanna was fundamentally a good person. And regardless of his promise to go with Johun to Coruscant, his first loyalty, Daravit felt, was to family. Of course, he told Zanna that the Jedi now knew the Sith still existed, and so Zanna immediately departed for Tython to warn Bane, dragging Daravit along with her. Johun was naturally concerned when he couldn't find his key witness, but he and Farfalla did find the data terminal that Zanna had been working at. And because Zanna had had to look up the coordinates for Tython before departing, it didn't take long for the two Jedi to realize where the Sith might be found. For Farfalla was now convinced that Johun was right, and the Sith were still out there. A party of 5 was hastily assembled to go to Tython. Besides Johun and Farfalla, the party included Raskta Lusu and her former apprentice Saro Zaj, an Echani and human respectively, both highly skilled in lightsaber combat, and Waror Daumat, an Ithorian gifted in the art of battle meditation. Zanna and Daravit only just made it to Tython ahead of the Jedi, by which point Bane, having found Belia's fortress and fought his way through hordes of her cyber zombies, had laid claim to the long-dead Sith Lord's holocron. There was only enough time to lock Daravit away in a small room before Master and Apprentice turned at bay to face the Jedi. At first, outnumbered 2-1 and with Waror's battle meditation boosting the combat skills of the other 4, the odds were weighted heavily against Bane and his apprentice. However, Bane did have his Orbalisk body armor, which rendered him almost immune to the lightsabers of the Jedi. Bane, recognizing Waror as the Jedi party's strength and weak link, moved in to kill him while he was distracted with his battle meditation. Johun managed to save the Ithorian by pushing him out of the way with the Force, but in that moment, Waror lost his concentration, and for a brief instant the other 4 Jedi were distracted by the sudden loss of that battle meditation. Seizing the opening, Zanna used her Summon Fear ability to distract Saro Zaj long enough for her to kill him. Then, using the dark side to conceal her presence, she snuck up behind Raskta as she was engaged with Bane and ran the Echani through from behind. With that, the battle turned decisively in the Sith's favor. Bane cut off Johun's right hand, beheaded Farfalla, and mortally wounded Waror, before moving in to finish the young man with a burst of Force lightning. But in his dying moments, the Ithorian erected a Force barrier around Bane so that the burst of lightning rebounded back on him. Zanna dispatched Johun, but by the time Waror succumbed and the barrier faded, Bane was a charred ruin. Not only had he suffered severe burns from his own attack, but the Force lightning had actually killed several of the Orbalisks. And as they died, the armored parasites had released their deadly toxins into the Sith Lord's bloodstream. Unless he received treatment, Bane was sure to die within days. But Daravit could only heal in the mundane sense, and the powers of the dark side are geared towards destruction, not healing. And so Zanna feared that her master would die before he could teach her everything he knew about the Sith. But then she remembered an old story her master had told her about someone who'd once saved his life. And so, after collecting the lightsabers of the dead Jedi, Zanna, Daravit, and a dying Bane made for Ambria and the camp of Caleb the Healer. After dragging the healer out of his hiding place in a cellar under his own hut, Zanna demanded that her master be healed, but Caleb, stubborn as ever, refused. No matter what Zanna threatened him with, torture or madness, Caleb defied her, pointing out that if she ever carried out her threats to destroy him, there would be no saving her master anyway. In the past, Bane had forced Caleb to save his life by threatening his daughter. But the healer had suspected that one day Bane would come to him again, and in the intervening years had sent his daughter far away from Ambria. And so now there was no leverage that Zanna could use against him. It seemed all was lost. Bane was going to die. But Daravit, still convinced of the fundamental goodness of his cousin, had a proposition of his own. He convinced Caleb to help Bane, but only if Zanna agreed to certain conditions. One, that a message be sent to the Jedi alerting them to where Bane was, and two, that the ship they'd come to Ambria on be sabotaged so that there could be no flight. This way, Bane would live, but he would be essentially a Jedi prisoner. And by helping to turn him over to the Jedi, Zanna would demonstrate that she was not beyond redemption. Now, I myself have said in several videos in this series of mine that redemption is a powerful theme of Star Wars, arguably its most important one, but I also have stipulated that redemption is only possible if you want it. And I think Daravit should have started cluing into just how far gone Zanna was when he had this little conversation with her over Bane's dying body. When he goes, at least he'll go peacefully. Peace is a lie. It doesn't matter if you die in your sleep or on the battlefield, dead is still dead. At least he's not feeling any pain. If you feel pain, it means you're still alive. Give me pain over peace any day. But it seemed Daravit's faith in his cousin was vindicated. The message was sent, and the ship was sabotaged. Caleb did his work, and Bane eventually regained consciousness, although he was still too weak to go anywhere. Zanna had no choice but to tell him what had happened, and at first the Sith Lord was convinced that she had betrayed him at the last. Rather than see the Sith go truly extinct, he urged his apprentice to flee. She must kill him, for he would rather die than be a Jedi prisoner, go into hiding, and one day take an apprentice of her own. But Zanna refused to abandon her master. She had a plan of her own. When the team of 14 Jedi arrived at Caleb's camp, led by the Twi'lek master Thonatu, they saw an abattoir. Caleb's body had been hacked into chunks scattered about the campsite, his severed head perched atop the upturned cookpot. Inside the healer's hut, they found a gibbering young man with one hand and a lightsaber. Consumed with madness, the man with the saber attacked, but he was easily dispatched. It didn't take long for the Jedi to piece together what had happened. The Sith Lord they'd been told of had gone to Caleb for healing, but upon learning that Caleb had betrayed him to the Jedi, had killed the healer before descending into utter madness. After all, the dark side is a corrupting thing. The lightsabers of the 5 Jedi that had died on Tython were recovered, and the party of 14 left Ambria, confident that the Sith were at last no more. And all the while, Zanna and Bane had been hiding in the cellar under Caleb's hut, with Zanna using her connection to the Force to conceal their presence. It doesn't take much effort for the reader to divine what really happened. Zanna had killed Caleb, butchering his corpse, and then had driven Daravit insane with her Sith sorcery, leaving him as essentially a staked goat for the Jedi to find and dispatch. Thus, the continued secrecy of the Sith was assured. Zanna relayed all this to Bane after he fully recovered, and the Sith Lord was impressed by his apprentice. You can even say that he was actually proud of her. "You have done well, Zanna. I underestimated you. Had I known your plans, I would never have asked you to kill me. You still have much to teach me. I will continue to study at your feet, Master. I will learn from your wisdom. I will discover your secrets, unlocking them one by one until everything you know, all your knowledge and all your power, is mine. And once you are no longer of use to me, I will destroy you. Truly a worthy successor.